So we're going to talk about today is the discovery call, and we're going to continue Catherine's theme of demystifying the sales process. So this is the part that I'm going to cover today. And specifically, what we're going to talk about is what I call like discovery call mapping. And what I mean by that is this. So remember, Catherine talked about how in a discovery call, there can only be three outcomes, right? You either qualify them in, or you qualify them out, or you basically don't have enough information. And so now you're going to have to talk again, right? Because there's only three essential possibilities for discovery calls. So if that is the outputs of a discovery call, then what are the inputs? We kind of talked about this a little bit last week. And so if we actually break it down in terms of B2B sales, there are four types of people who would get on a call with you. The first one is the novice. This person has, and I'm sure you've had calls with this. The person has very little knowledge or experience and has never bought anything like what you're selling before. So essentially, they don't know what they don't know. They've got a basic idea, but that's pretty much it. All right, that's the novice. The second is the DIYer. They do it themselves. So this is somebody that I know Lawrence pointed out to. This is someone who has experience because they try to do it themselves. Successfully, unsuccessfully, who knows? But they did roll up their sleeves and try to do it themselves. All right. The third one is the dissatisfied. So this is the person who has experience because they have bought a service like what you're offering before, but they're unhappy with that service. They're not satisfied with the service that they got. And the last one here is the person, the outgrower. So this person has experience because they bought the service similar to what you offered, but has outgrown it. They need something more now, which is why they're knocking at your door. And so if you think about it, these are the types of people that are most likely what you're going to be talking to, knocking at your door from a sales perspective. So it is your job to figure out as quickly as you can how to drive the outcome to one of those outcomes, qualified in, qualified out, and whether or not you need to talk again. Okay, so that's what we're going to do today. So we're going to do some workshopping. So I'm going to open it up, do some workshopping so that you come out of today's session with a quick win. Okay, and to get started here, what I'm going to ask you is to think about number one, what type or types of buyer do you typically encounter? Because if you think about it, your discovery calls are going to go very differently depending on which type of buyer actually shows up because they have very different needs. So which type or types of buyer do you typically encounter? Now, for me, because my tools for onboarding, I can tell you that it's almost always the person who DIYs. Because the biggest thing that I deal with is, they have some homegrown process and they need me to compare my process with their homegrown process. So what type or types of buyer do you typically encounter? Yeah, one of the big things that you'll find between, especially since a lot of you have novice people that come to you, is you probably understand that whenever you're talking with a novice, you probably will have to do a lot of education. That's number one. And the second, because they're a novice, or someone who did a DIY, they may have trouble understanding why you charge what you charge. Understanding the value is going to be difficult because one, the novice doesn't know what they don't know. They don't know how important that problem is going to be. And the person who rolled up their sleeve, they may have a very skewed idea of pricing, right? So that's going to be very different. So that's why I mean, it's like the different people come to you, your calls are going to look very, very different. Okay. So now what the next thing here, the next exercise is what are 2 or 3 questions that you can ask to figure out which one of these buyers they are as quickly as you can. I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. Okay, 4. So here, as an example, let's take Catherine's grow groups as an example. So what questions would you ask to figure out as quickly as you can what type of person they are? So here I obviously I put together some questions that I would ask. So the first one that I would ask, as you can see here, is that have you ever had a paid membership to a networking or a peer advisory group before? Yes or no? Because if they have, then I know that at a minimum, they're talking to me because they're in the bottom two, either dissatisfied or outgrown. Or if they say no, then I know that they're probably in the top two. If they say yes, then I'm going to ask what group. Vistage, Convene, BNI, and so on. And also I'm going to ask, are you still a member? Because those 2 questions will tell me a lot about are they dissatisfied or have they outgrown their current group. If they say no, then I'm going to ask, how do you network today? Do they not network today? Do they only do it on LinkedIn? Is it free events? And where do you turn for business advice today? Do they not turn to anybody? Do they just talk to friends? Again, LinkedIn, and so on and so forth. That tells that you can see just a couple of multiple choice questions. I'm going to figure out really quickly how to prepare for the meeting because I'll know a lot about them. Now, so I'm going to open up the time here. So this is just an example for Catherine, right? What you would ask for Catherine to try to really quickly figure out where they're going to be. So I'm going to open it up here. And I'm actually going to stop sharing. I'm actually going to stop sharing this presentation and I'm going to open up actually a blank template here. So as a workshop here, I'm going to ask you, what are some questions that you would ask? Like if you knew the answers to these questions prior to the meeting, that's going to be really impactful for you. But what questions would you ask? This particular one, I mean, obviously there's not enough time in the call to really workshop some of these. But I wanted to give you some ideas of what you could ask to really quickly identify who is coming into your call if you don't know. And because of what they said and the information that you gathered, then you can really quickly move on to, prepping for that call and getting ready for the next information. Now, in the example, going back to the example with Catherine, I'm sure you're probably looking over all these questions and stuff like that, and one of the big things that I know a lot of people think about when they go through this exercise is that's a lot of questions. Are people actually going to answer these questions just to book a meeting with me? And it is a lot of questions. And if you put all of these questions up front as a gate to booking a meeting with you, that's going to scare people off. So this is one of the reasons why I recommend stuff like this, where you ask these questions as part of a step 2. So they submit the contact form first, they get to your questionnaire as a step 2, and if they skip it, they don't answer anything, that's perfectly fine because then you can do whatever it is that you're doing today, right? There's no difference. But if they do answer the questions ahead of time, this is where you can save that 7 to 10 minutes of fact finding because you've collected that information and you've identified who is coming into the call beforehand. And to give you an example of why this is important, so if we go back to the example with Catherine, let's say hypothetically they said, oh, I have a paid membership and I'm part of BNI. What's really important is that if you know this information before your first meeting, you can have a slide like this prepared on meeting number 1, ready to show. And that moves the presentation that you have beyond just theory, because now you're talking specifically to them and to their scenario. and you help them visualize the difference between their current state and the future state. And that's where the power comes in because think about it. And normally in meeting number one is very generic, right? It's very cookie cutter because you're just gathering information. But now, because you gather information ahead of time, now you can be very specific in your meeting and targeted. I'm going to show you another example. This one, I'm using charts just as an example. I'm not sure how you present your value prop, but let's say hypothetically you did it in a value prop, for example. You could have your prospects KPI or metric versus your client's KPI metric. And again, just as an example, um, but again, this is another way to help your prospects visualize the difference because you learned something about them. So Bruce said, as we were kind of brainstorming in this workshop, you talked about revenue goals, right? This is your revenue goals, and you talked excellently about like, you could actually do more. This would be really good to show them like, hey, typically when customers work with me, we can improve the revenue goals by hypothetically, 20, 30% or something like that. Let me show you what that means for you. And this is, to me, is really powerful in meeting number one to be able to do that. As opposed to, if you think about it, a lot of times in order to show something like this, you have to wait until meeting number two. But if you have this concept in meeting number one, that really helps you get meeting number two booked. All right, I know we went a little bit over time. Um, so can I answer any questions today? If you have to drop, you're free to drop.